In the early years of the 19th century, the island of Nantucket sat quietly in the Atlantic, low and wind-shaped, its shores worn smooth by centuries of tide and weather. From a distance, it did not appear remarkable. There were no great harbors, no towering cliffs, no defensive walls. Yet for generations, Nantucket had been bound to the sea more completely than almost any other place in the world. By 1819, whaling was not merely an occupation on the island. It was the foundation of daily life, the rhythm by which time was measured. Ships departed and returned according to seasons that mattered more than calendars. Families learned patience early. Wives, parents, and children understood that absence was not an exception, but an expectation. The oil drawn from whales lit streets and homes across Europe and America. It burned clean and bright in lamps, making it valuable beyond any other fuel of its time. Baleen, known then as whalebone, was shaped into tools, stays, brushes, and countless everyday objects. A single successful voyage could support families for years. A failed one could ruin them just as thoroughly. Whaling ships were built for endurance rather than speed. They were strong-bodied with broad beams and reinforced frames, designed to withstand years at sea and repeated contact with ice, storms, and heavy loads. Their decks carried the marks of earlier voyages, scratches from hauling boats, stains from oil, and fittings worn smooth by constant use. The Essex was one such ship. Built in 799 in Amesbury, Massachusetts, she was already 2 decades old by the time of her final voyage. At 87 feet long, she was not among the largest whalers, but she was considered reliable. Her design reflected an era when practicality mattered more than elegance. She carried 3 whaleboats, lighter craft used during hunts, stacked carefully on deck and launched when whales were sighted. Life aboard a whaler followed strict routines shaped by necessity. Watches divided the day and night. Maintenance never truly stopped. Sails were mended when calm allowed. Lines were checked and recoiled. Barrels were cleaned and prepared long before they would be filled. Food was simple and repetitive. Salted beef and pork, hard biscuits, dried peas, rice, and occasional molasses formed the core of daily rations. Fresh food was rare and prized. When possible, fish were caught over the side, and birds taken if they came within reach. Water was stored carefully, measured and rationed, always vulnerable to spoilage. The men who sailed these ships accepted discomfort as part of the contract. Cold, heat, dampness, and confinement were expected. What mattered was discipline and shared understanding. A whaling voyage could last 2 or 3 years, crossing oceans few people ever saw, visiting ports that existed only as names in logbooks. In August of 1819, the Essex was made ready once more. Supplies were loaded carefully, barrels of food and water, tools for ship and hunt, navigational instruments, spare spars, sails, and rigging. Each item had a place, and each place reflected long experience. Nothing unnecessary was carried, and nothing essential was forgotten deliberately. The harbor filled with quiet activity. Men said their goodbyes without ceremony. Emotions were restrained, not because they were absent, but because open expression did little to shorten the time apart. Experience had taught the island that departures were easier when handled plainly. As the Essex prepared to sail, she carried with her the expectations of Nantucket itself. She was one of many ships that left the island's shores each year, disappearing beyond the horizon toward distant seas where fortune and danger existed in equal measure. No one on the dock believed the voyage would be easy, but nothing suggested it would become one of the most severe survival stories in maritime history. With sails raised and the wind carrying her southward, the Essex moved steadily away from Nantucket toward open water, toward the long pursuit that defined the age of whaling. An industry built on patience and endurance. and a deep reliance on the sea's uncertain generosity. The Essex sailed with a crew shaped by experience, ambition, and the quiet calculations of men who understood the risks of the sea. At its head was Captain George Pollard, Jr., only 28 years old at the time of departure. Despite his youth, Pollard came from a long line of Nantucket whalers. Command was not unfamiliar to him, though this was his first voyage as captain. He was known as steady rather than forceful, cautious rather than bold. In an industry that often rewarded aggression, Pollard relied more on order and restraint. Serving as first mate was Owen Chase, older than Pollard and more experienced in the practical mechanics of whaling. Chase was methodical, attentive to detail, and confident in his abilities. He had spent years at sea and understood both the technical demands of the hunt and the fragile balance required to keep a crew functioning under long strain. Though subordinate in rank, Chase's judgment carried weight aboard the ship. Second mate Matthew Joy completed the command structure. Joy was quieter, physically strong, and respected by the men he oversaw. He had already endured multiple voyages and understood how quickly conditions could change. His health, however, was not robust, something that would later matter more than anyone could have anticipated. The rest of the crew reflected the social structure of Nantucket whaling. Some were seasoned sailors who had crossed oceans before. Others were young men on their first long voyage, learning the rhythms of shipboard life through repetition rather than instruction. Among them was Thomas Nickerson, a cabin boy only 14 years old. His duties were simple but constant, running messages, assisting officers, cleaning, and observing everything. Years later, his memory would preserve details others forgot. Life aboard the Essex settled quickly into routine. Watches rotated through the day and night. Half the crew slept while the other worked, then changed places. This rhythm never stopped, even in calm seas. Sails required constant adjustment. Rigging was inspected daily. Any weakness ignored could become catastrophic weeks or months later. Cleanliness mattered more than comfort. Decks were scrubbed regularly to prevent rot and reduce slipping hazards. Below decks, air was stale and dim. Hammocks were slung close together, leaving little personal space. Privacy did not exist in any meaningful sense. Personal possessions were limited to what could be carried easily and stored compactly. Meals were taken at fixed times. Food was prepared in a small galley, usually boiled into stews that combined whatever ingredients were available. Hard biscuits were softened in liquid when possible. Meat was often heavily salted, its taste sharp and its texture tough. Hunger sharpened appreciation for even modest variety. Discipline was enforced quietly. Orders were expected to be followed without delay, but harsh punishment was not common aboard the Essex. Cooperation mattered more than fear. A crew that worked willingly was safer than one held together by force. As the ship moved southward, away from familiar waters, the crew adjusted gradually to longer stretches without land. The coastline faded from memory. Days were measured by weather, by sail changes, by small repairs completed and undone again by use. The Essex was not remarkable among whalers. That was precisely the point. She was one of many ships engaged in the same pursuit, following routes established by decades of experience. No one aboard expected distinction. Success meant returning quietly, holds full, after years away. The sea ahead held no visible warning, only distance, routine, and the slow accumulation of moments that would, long after, be remembered for reasons none of them could yet imagine. As the Essex moved steadily away from Nantucket, the familiar patterns of coastal sailing gave way to the wider uncertainties of the open Atlantic. The shoreline disappeared entirely, replaced by long horizons and the regular motion of the sea beneath the hull. From this point forward, there would be no quick return, no shelter except what the ship itself could provide. The early weeks passed without incident. Winds were generally favorable, and the ship made good time. Sails were adjusted frequently, catching shifts in direction and strength as the weather changed. The crew settled further into routine, learning one another's habits and temperaments. Small frictions appeared, then smoothed over by necessity. There was little room for prolonged disagreement aboard a working vessel. Life continued in repetition. Lines were checked and coiled. Woodwork was inspected for early signs of strain. The ship's pumps were tested daily, even when no water appeared below. This attention to small details was not excessive caution. It was habit formed by generations of sailors who understood how minor neglect could grow into fatal damage. As the Essex moved south, temperatures changed gradually. Cool Atlantic air gave way to warmer conditions. Clothing was adjusted accordingly, though protection against damp remained essential. Salt air clung to everything. Metal fittings required regular cleaning to prevent corrosion. Canvas stiffened and softened again with alternating sun and spray. The first serious test came sooner than expected. Not long after departure, the ship encountered a violent squall. Winds rose sharply, striking without warning. Seas grew confused, waves breaking against the hull at irregular angles. Sails were reduced quickly, though not without difficulty. The ship heeled heavily, water pouring across the deck. At one point, the Essex was knocked nearly on her side. For a moment, it seemed possible she might not right herself. Loose objects slid across the deck. Barrels shifted below. Men clung to rigging and rail, working by instinct rather than thought. Then, just as abruptly as it had come, the storm passed. The Essex recovered, sails were reset, and damage assessed. One of the whaleboats had been lost overboard, torn from its fittings by the force of the wind and waves. It was a serious loss, but not an irreparable one. Repairs were made where possible, and the ship continued on her course. The incident left its mark. It reminded the crew that danger did not wait for distant seas. Even early in a voyage, with land not yet fully forgotten, the ocean could assert itself with little warning. Afterward, the days resumed their steady rhythm. The Essex crossed the equator and entered the southern hemisphere. Stars unfamiliar to northern sailors appeared overhead. Heat grew oppressive at times, forcing adjustments to work schedules and clothing. Below decks became stifling, air heavy and unmoving. Water consumption increased. Rations were monitored carefully. Even at this early stage, waste was discouraged. Long experience had taught captains that shortages often developed slowly, unnoticed, until they became impossible to correct. The ship pressed on. Ahead lay Cape Horn, a passage known among sailors for its unpredictability and violence. Rounding it would mark a true transition from Atlantic to Pacific, from known routes to the long hunting grounds beyond. The Essex approached it without ceremony, carrying with her the accumulated habits of routine and restraint, unaware that these same qualities would later become the difference between survival and loss. Cape Horn did not announce itself with grandeur. There were no visible markers, no clear boundary between one ocean and the next. Instead, the transition revealed itself through changes in wind, temperature, and sea behavior. Swells grew longer and heavier. Winds shifted unpredictably, sometimes strengthening without warning, sometimes falling away entirely. The Essex approached the southern passage with caution. Sails were shortened more often now, adjusted constantly to match conditions that refused to settle. The air grew colder, sharper, carrying moisture that clung to clothing and skin. Decks remained wet for days at a time, offering little chance for anything to dry. The crew worked steadily. Rounding Cape Horn was not a moment of triumph, but of endurance, Progress was measured in miles gained and lost, in hours spent pushing forward only to be driven back by opposing winds. Patience mattered as much as strength. Waves struck the hull with greater force. They rose high and broke hard, sending water sweeping across the deck. Below, the ship creaked and flexed, timbers responding to pressure with familiar but uneasy sounds. Men listened closely to these noises, learning to distinguish between ordinary strain and something more dangerous. Cold became a constant presence. Hands numbed quickly when exposed. Work slowed, not from lack of effort, but from the physical limits imposed by temperature and wetness. Movements had to be deliberate. Mistakes here could cost fingers, balance, or lives. Despite the difficulty, the Essex held together. Her hull proved sound. Her rigging endured repeated strain. The loss of the earlier whaleboat remained a concern, but the ship still carried enough equipment to continue her voyage. When at last the seas began to moderate, the change was gradual. The Pacific did not arrive suddenly. It revealed itself through subtle shifts, swells smoothing, winds aligning more consistently, the air losing some of its cutting edge. The crew sensed it before charts confirmed it. They had entered a different ocean. With the Horn behind them, the ship's purpose sharpened. The long transit was nearing its end. Ahead lay the whaling grounds of the South Pacific, vast and unpredictable, where months or years might pass in search of whales. Routine adjusted again. Watch patterns shifted to accommodate new weather rhythms. Equipment was prepared for active hunting. Harpoons were inspected, lines coiled and recoiled until they moved smoothly through hands and blocks. The ship slowed. No longer racing to cross an ocean, the Essex began to drift deliberately through likely waters, scanning horizons for signs of spouts or breaches. Men watched from aloft for hours at a time, eyes straining against glare and distance. The pace of the voyage changed. Transit gave way to pursuit. The long chase that defined whaling life began in earnest, quiet days, punctuated by sudden action, patience tested by weeks of waiting. The sea ahead appeared calm. Nothing suggested that these waters, more distant from land than any the Essex had yet sailed, would become the setting for events unlike anything the crew or the whaling world had ever experienced before. In the open reaches of the South Pacific, the Essex entered waters where the horizon often remained unchanged for days at a time. Sky and sea blended into long, unbroken lines. The ship moved slowly now, its course adjusted less by destination than by possibility. Whaling required waiting. Men spent long hours aloft, standing on narrow platforms near the mastheads, eyes trained on the distance. From this height, the first sign of a whale was often no more than a faint disturbance on the surface. A brief rise, a mist of vapor, a dark curve that vanished almost as soon as it appeared. When nothing was seen, the day passed quietly. Sails were tended, gear was maintained, harpoons were sharpened again and again, their edges tested carefully. Lines were coiled and laid out in readiness, ensuring they would run free without tangling when needed. These tasks were repeated not because they always required it, but because preparedness could not be improvised at the moment of action. The crew learned to read subtle signs, changes in bird behavior, variations in the color of the water, the presence of drifting matter, all could suggest whales nearby. Knowledge passed quietly from experienced hands to those newer to the work, through observation rather than instruction. When whales were sighted, everything changed at once. A cry from aloft, sharp and unmistakable, cut through the routine. Men moved quickly, but without panic. Whale boats were lowered into the water with practiced coordination. Each boat carried a small crew, armed with harpoons and lances, their movements precise and economical. The Essex remained behind. Once the boats were away, the ship maneuvered carefully to maintain position, prepared to assist or retrieve crews when the hunt concluded. From the deck, the men watched distant figures rise and fall with the swell, their fate temporarily separate from the ship. Sperm whales were powerful animals. They traveled in groups, their massive bodies moving with surprising speed when disturbed. Hunting them was dangerous work, demanding both courage and restraint. A mistake in timing or position could send a boat tumbling or entangle men in lines moving faster than thought. The Essex's early successes were modest. Some hunts yielded oil, others ended with damaged equipment or nothing at all. Such inconsistency was expected. Whaling voyages rarely followed predictable patterns, and patience was essential. As weeks passed, the ship ranged farther west, deeper into the Pacific. Distance from known ports increased steadily. Charts grew less precise. The sense of isolation deepened, not dramatically, but gradually, until land existed only as an idea rather than a destination. Life aboard adjusted accordingly. Provisions were monitored more carefully. Fresh food, when obtained, was shared deliberately, never wasted. Water rations were checked and rechecked. The awareness that resupply lay far behind them sharpened attention to detail. The sea remained calm more often than not. Days passed under wide skies, broken occasionally by squalls that arrived and departed without warning. Nights were filled with unfamiliar stars, their patterns slowly becoming familiar to those who watched them regularly. The hunt continued. Each lowering of boats carried risk, but it was risk the men accepted as part of their work. None could know that among the many whales that moved through these waters, one would soon alter the course of their lives entirely. For now, the Essex sailed on, steady and unremarkable, engaged in the ancient pursuit that had drawn her from Nantucket across half the world, unaware that patience, discipline, and routine were about to be tested beyond any known precedent. The morning of November 20, 1820, began without distinction. The sea lay relatively calm, the swell long and measured. Visibility was good. From the deck of the Essex, nothing suggested that the day would differ from countless others spent searching the open Pacific. Shortly after sunrise, whales were sighted. Spouts appeared on the horizon several miles off. The familiar call was given, and the ship altered course. Whale boats were lowered with practiced efficiency. Owen Chase commanded one, Matthew Joy another, while the Essex herself remained under the control of Captain Pollard. The hunt unfolded in the usual way. Boats spread out, each approaching from a different angle. The water churned as whales sounded and resurfaced. Harpoons were thrown. Lines ran out rapidly, humming with tension as they cut through the sea. Then something changed. One of the whales, a large bull sperm whale, behaved differently. Instead of fleeing or sounding, it turned. Its massive head rose partially above the surface, exposing a broad, blunt forehead scarred by old encounters. For a moment, it appeared to watch the ship. At first, no one understood the significance. Sperm whales were known to be unpredictable, but direct aggression toward ships was rare. The men assumed it would soon dive and disappear like the others. It did not. The whale began moving toward the Essex, slowly at first, then with increasing speed. Its body drove forward with deliberate force, propelled by powerful strokes of its tail. The water ahead of it boiled and parted. Captain Pollard shouted commands, ordering sails adjusted in an attempt to turn the ship. But the distance was short, and the response of the Essex was limited. The whale struck. The impact was sudden and violent. The ship shuddered as if it had collided with a reef. Timbers cracked. The bow lurched sideways. Men were thrown off balance as the force rippled through the hull. For a brief moment, the whale drifted away. Water rushed into the damaged section of the bow. The crew scrambled to assess the breach, some believing the worst had already happened. Then the whale returned. This time, It struck with greater force, ramming the ship head-on. The sound was deeper, heavier, wood giving way under immense pressure. The bow collapsed inward. Planks split. The sea surged through the opening. The whale disappeared beneath the surface. Silence followed, broken only by the sound of water flooding into the ship. The Essex was mortally wounded. The damage was beyond repair. Pumps were brought into action, but the rate of flooding quickly outpaced them. The ship began to settle by the bow, her deck tilting at a shallow but unmistakable angle. Boats returned hurriedly from the hunt. Chase and Joy reached the ship and climbed aboard, their initial confusion giving way to the stark realization of what had occurred. The whale was gone. The Essex was sinking. Captain Pollard issued orders without hesitation. Supplies were gathered immediately. Water casks, food, navigation instruments, and tools were brought up from below as quickly as possible. There was no time to save personal belongings beyond what could be carried. The sea remained calm. This made the unfolding disaster feel almost unreal. There was no storm, no chaos of weather, only the steady movement of water rising where a ship had once been sound. As the Essex continued to sink, the crew prepared to abandon her. No one spoke of the whale. There was no explanation to offer, no precedent to rely upon. The event defied experience, leaving only its consequences. By midday, the Essex was no longer seaworthy. She had carried them across oceans. She had been their shelter, their livelihood, their certainty in a vast and indifferent sea. Now, she was being claimed by the water. The age of whaling had produced many dangers, but none like this. An encounter that would reshape how the sea and those who worked upon it would be remembered. The decision came without debate. The Essex could not be saved. Water continued to rise within her hull, spreading through spaces that had once held provisions and tools. The angle of the deck increased slowly but steadily, confirming what every experienced sailor already knew. She was lost. Captain Pollard ordered the ship abandoned. The 3 remaining whaleboats were brought alongside and secured as carefully as conditions allowed. Each was small, open, and never intended for extended travel across open ocean. Now they would carry the entire crew. The transfer was controlled and methodical. Supplies were lowered first, barrels of water, bags of hard biscuit, navigation instruments, firearms, and tools. Each item was weighed not only by usefulness, but by how much strain it would place on boats already pushed near their limits. Water mattered most. Casks were divided as evenly as possible. Every drop would become critical in the days ahead. Food followed, though the quantity was far from sufficient for what lay before them. There was no illusion about this. Survival would depend on restraint and chance as much as planning. Personal belongings were left behind. Men took little more than the clothes they wore. A few small items were slipped into pockets, perhaps a knife, a keepsake, or something that could later be traded or used. These gestures were quiet and private. The sea remained calm. This calm was deceptive. It allowed the work to proceed smoothly, but it also emphasized the isolation of the scene. 3 small boats clustered beside a dying ship in the middle of the Pacific, thousands of miles from familiar shores. As the last supplies were lowered, the crew gathered briefly on deck. There was no formal farewell. No ritual marked the end. One by one, men climbed down into the boats, steadying themselves as they went. Captain Pollard was the last to leave. He paused only briefly before stepping down, turning once to look at the ship he had commanded. The Essex's bow was already deep in the water, her stern rising slightly as the sea claimed her. Then he followed his crew. The boats pulled away. Oars dipped into the water, creating small ripples that spread and vanished quickly. From a short distance they watched as the Essex continued to settle, her her deck slipping beneath the surface inch by inch. The ship went down slowly. Masts tilted, then disappeared. The hull slipped beneath the water without breaking apart, leaving behind only floating debris and a spreading slick of oil. The Essex was gone. The ocean closed over her, erasing all immediate trace of her passage. There was no marker, no sound beyond the soft movement of waves. What remained were 3 small boats. Each carried men who had expected to return home aboard a full-size ship, not to face the open Pacific with limited food, uncertain navigation, and no clear plan beyond survival. They regrouped briefly, the boats close together. Decisions had to be made quickly. Direction would matter. Choices now would shape everything that followed. The age of whaling had taught these men many lessons. None had prepared them for this. With oars dipping steadily, the boats began to move away from the place where the Essex had vanished, toward an ocean that offered no guidance, only distance, and the long uncertainty ahead. Once the boats had pulled clear of the sinking ship, the vastness of the Pacific asserted itself fully. There was no sense of direction offered by the sea. No visible landmarks, only 3 small boats drifting together on a surface that stretched unbroken in every direction. The men rested their oars briefly, allowing themselves a moment to breathe and assess what remained. The first concern was navigation. Charts were brought out and weighed down against the breeze. The officers gathered close, speaking quietly but urgently. Several options were discussed, each carrying its own risks. To the west lay islands that were closer in distance, but poorly charted and widely feared among sailors of the time. Stories of hostile encounters, whether true or exaggerated, weighed heavily on decision-making. To the east lay the coast of South America. It was much farther than the islands, but it was known. The route had been traveled before. Rescue, however distant, was at least imaginable there. The choice reflected the mindset of experienced sailors. Better a longer journey into certainty than a shorter one into fear and rumor. The decision was made. The boats would attempt to reach South America. Rations were calculated immediately. Daily allowances of food and water were set with care. Portions were small, measured precisely, and distributed under strict supervision. There would be no indulgence, no deviation. Survival depended on discipline as much as endurance. The boats separated slightly to maintain maneuverability, but remained within sight of one another. Each was commanded by an officer. Captain Pollard took one boat, Owen Chase another, and Matthew Joy the third. Duties were assigned, watches established, and responsibilities clarified. Life in the boats settled into a new kind of routine. Men rowed for hours at a time, then rested briefly, cramped and exposed. There was no shelter from sun or spray. Salt dried on skin, clothing stiffened, and hands blistered quickly. At night, temperatures dropped sharply, the air cold and damp. Sleep came in fragments. Men lay curled against one another for warmth, shifting carefully to avoid capsizing the boats. Every movement had to be deliberate. Even rest required attention. Food was consumed sparingly. Hard biscuit was broken into small pieces. Water was sipped, never swallowed quickly. Hunger became constant, a low presence that sharpened thought and dulled strength at the same time. The ocean did not remain calm. Wind shifted, sometimes favorably, sometimes against them. Swells grew larger, lifting the boats high and dropping them again with unsettling force. Water sloshed constantly at their feet, never fully drained away. Despite this, progress was made. Oars dipped steadily, strokes timed to conserve energy rather than maximize speed. Navigation relied on sun and stars when visible, though cloud often obscured them. Course corrections were made gradually, with caution. Days passed. The boats grew weathered. Men grew thinner. Yet discipline held. No one broke rationing rules. No one abandoned duty. The distance ahead remained enormous. What mattered now was not how far they had to go, but how carefully they could continue. Each day survived increased the chance, however small, of eventual landfall. The Essex was already far behind them. Ahead lay nothing but water, sky, and the slow, relentless test of endurance that would soon demand more than any of them yet understood. After weeks at sea, when exhaustion had settled into every movement, and the men had begun to measure time only by rations and daylight, land finally appeared. At first it was uncertain. Low, pale, and barely distinguishable from cloud. Some doubted their eyes. Others watched silently, afraid that hope might dissolve if acknowledged too soon. But as the boats drew nearer, the shape became undeniable. It was land. The island rose from the ocean as a narrow ridge of coral and stone surrounded by reefs that made approach difficult. Waves broke sharply against its edges, forcing the boats to search for a passage through shallow water without being smashed apart. With careful timing, they made it ashore. The men stepped onto Henderson Island, unknown to them by name, uninhabited and largely barren. The ground felt strange beneath their feet after so long afloat. Some knelt briefly, steadying themselves. Others simply stood, uncertain what to do now that movement had stopped. The island offered little comfort. There were no trees, no streams, no soil suitable for cultivation. Vegetation was sparse and low. The sun beat down unbroken, and shade was almost non-existent. Yet compared to the open ocean, it was refuge. Fresh water was found, but only barely. A small spring yielded a limited supply, just enough to replenish what little they carried. Shellfish and birds were gathered cautiously. Food existed, but not in abundance, and never enough to support everyone for long. The men rested. Wounds were cleaned as best as possible. Salt, stiff clothing was adjusted. Bodies weakened by hunger responded slowly even to rest. The reality of their condition became clearer now that the immediate effort of rowing had paused. A decision had to be made. Staying on the island would mean slow starvation for all. Leaving offered a chance, however slim, for rescue. The officers gathered again, voices quiet, reasoning constrained by exhaustion and diminishing options. 3 men chose to remain. They believed their strength insufficient for another long journey and hoped the island might offer enough to sustain them until rescue arrived. The others prepared to leave, knowing the choice could not be reversed once the boats departed. The farewell was brief. There were no promises. No certainty existed for any of them. Each man understood that survival now depended as much on chance as on effort. The boats were relaunched. Those remaining watched from shore as the others pushed off, oars dipping into water once more. The figures in the boats grew smaller, then indistinct, until they vanished entirely into the glare of the sea. Henderson Island fell silent again. For those who left, the horizon closed once more around their boats. The water stretched endlessly ahead. Their rations were now even more limited, their bodies weaker, and the distance to land still immense. They had touched solid ground, but the journey was far from over. What lay ahead would test not only their endurance, but the limits of what men could bear when the sea offered no mercy and survival demanded choices no one had expected to face. Once the boats left Henderson Island, the ocean seemed larger than before. The brief contact with land had sharpened awareness of what they had lost. Strength did not return as hoped. Instead, fatigue deepened, settling into muscles that no longer recovered between days. The boats moved more slowly now, each stroke requiring greater effort than the last. Rations were reduced again. What had once seemed impossibly small portions were divided further. Biscuit was ground into crumbs and mixed with water to create something swallowable. Water itself became the most closely guarded resource. Each man received only what was judged necessary to prevent collapse, not comfort. Thirst altered thought. Mouths dried. Tongues swelled. Speech became slow and deliberate, not from reflection, but from effort. Skin cracked under sun and salt. Eyes burned constantly, sensitive to light and wind. Physical decline was impossible to hide. Weight dropped rapidly. Strength failed unevenly. Some men weakened quickly, others more gradually. Coordination suffered. Simple tasks required assistance. Rowing watches shortened as arms failed sooner than before. Illness followed hunger. Infections that would once have been minor became serious. Wounds healed poorly. Weakness made balance uncertain, increasing the risk of injury in boats that allowed no margin for error. The sea offered no relief. Winds shifted without pattern. Calm days trapped heat and glare. Rough days brought spray that soaked clothing and chilled bodies already struggling to regulate warmth. Sleep, when possible, did little to restore energy. Deaths began quietly. There were no sudden moments. Men faded over days, growing weaker until they could no longer row or eat. When one died, the boat stopped briefly. The body was lowered into the sea with minimal ceremony, not from disrespect, but from necessity. As losses mounted, the remaining men faced realities they had avoided naming. Food could not last long enough. This was not a conclusion reached suddenly. It emerged gradually through calculation and observation. The officers spoke privately at first, weighing what survival might require. The silence that followed these discussions carried meaning even before words were spoken. When the decision was finally acknowledged, it was done without argument. The use of the dead to sustain the living had precedent at sea. It was understood as a last measure, employed only when no alternative remained. There was no attempt to justify it beyond necessity. The process was handled with restraint. Portions were distributed carefully, no one taking more than another. There was no sense of relief, only grim continuation. Eating became an act of survival stripped of all other meaning. Morale did not improve. If anything, the knowledge of what had become necessary weighed heavily on everyone. Yet discipline remained. No one abandoned their duties. Oars continued to move when strength allowed. Navigation continued, guided by experience and diminishing hope. Boats separated at times due to weather and fatigue. Communication became difficult. Each crew existed increasingly within its own struggle, uncertain of the fate of the others. In Pollard's boat, decline was severe. More men were lost. Decisions grew harder. Strength faded unevenly, forcing difficult calculations about who could continue and who could not. Chance played a role that no one pretended to control. In Chase's boat, endurance held slightly longer. Careful navigation and discipline maintained some measure of order, though suffering was no less real. Each sunrise brought uncertainty about who would still be alive by nightfall. The ocean remained unchanged. It carried the boats without judgment, indifferent to their condition. Days passed without visible progress. Distance closed slowly, measured in exhaustion rather than miles. Survival narrowed to the present moment. The future no longer existed as a concept, only the next ration, the next watch, the next breath. The men continued not because they believed in rescue, but because stopping meant death. The age of whaling had taught endurance. This was endurance stripped to its most basic form. Movement without hope, survival without promise, and the quiet acceptance of choices no one had imagined making when the Essex first left Nantucket. The boats did not remain together. Storms, exhaustion, and weakened coordination gradually forced distance between them. What began as careful spacing widened into separation that could not always be corrected. When waves rose or winds shifted suddenly, keeping sight of one another became impossible. Each boat became its own world. In Captain Pollard's boat, conditions worsened rapidly. Strength failed unevenly. Decisions became heavier, shaped by dwindling numbers and shrinking capacity to row or navigate. One by one, men were lost to hunger and exposure. The sea received them without sound. Eventually, only Pollard and Charles Ramsdell remained alive. They drifted for days, barely able to move, their boat carried more by current than by effort. They had no strength left for rowing. Water was gone. Food was gone. They lay in the bottom of the boat, conscious but fading, their survival hanging on chance alone. In Owen Chase's boat, discipline endured longer. Chase, along with Benjamin Lawrence and the young Thomas Nickerson, maintained strict rationing and watch schedules as long as possible. Navigation continued whenever the sky allowed. Their strength diminished, but coordination remained. They were found first. On February 18, 1820, the British ship Indian sighted Chase's boat. The men aboard were barely recognizable as sailors. Emaciated, burned by sun and salt, too weak to stand. They were lifted aboard gently, given water in careful amounts, and allowed to rest under watchful care. Rescue came quietly. There was no celebration. Survival had narrowed emotion to exhaustion. The men slept deeply, some for days, while their bodies began the slow process of recovery. Pollard and Ramsdell were discovered later. On February 23, 1821, the American ship Dolphin came upon their drifting boat. They were near death, unable to signal. The timing was narrow. Another day or two might have been too late. They were taken aboard, tended carefully, and carried back toward land. The third boat was never rescued at sea. Months later, it was found washed ashore on a distant island. Inside were remains that confirmed the fate of its crew. The sea had carried it far, then released it without explanation. The men left behind on Henderson Island were not forgotten. In April of 1821, they were discovered alive by the ship Surrey. Against expectation, they had survived by adapting to the island's limited resources, waiting without certainty for rescue that eventually came. The survivors were reunited gradually. They arrived in ports separated by time and distance, their experiences overlapping but distinct. Stories were shared cautiously, often incompletely. Some details were too heavy to speak of openly. The voyage of the Essex had ended, but its consequences were only beginning to unfold, etched not in the ocean which quickly erased all traces, but in the lives of those who returned carrying memory loss, and a survival that came at a cost none of them had anticipated. The men who returned from the sea did not come back unchanged. Physically, recovery took months. Hunger had reshaped their bodies, weakening bones and muscles, leaving lasting damage that no rest could fully undo. Sun and salt had scarred their skin. Some never regained their former strength, their working lives at sea shortened or ended entirely. Emotionally, the return was slower. Nantucket received the survivors quietly. There were no parades, no public ceremonies. Whaling communities were familiar with loss, but the scale and nature of what had happened to the Essex unsettled even seasoned sailors. Questions followed them. How had the ship been lost? Why had the boat sailed into such isolation? What choices had been made afterward? These questions surfaced in conversations, inquiries, and court proceedings, but answers were rarely simple. Captain George Pollard Jr. stood before a court of inquiry. The findings cleared him of wrongdoing in the loss of the ship. The whale strike was acknowledged as an extraordinary event, beyond reasonable anticipation, yet judgment did not end with official conclusions. Reputation at sea depended as much on perception as on record. Pollard would sail again. Years later, he took command of another whaling ship. That voyage, too, ended in disaster. The vessel wrecked on a reef. After that, Pollard's career at sea ended. He returned to Nantucket and spent the remainder of his life working as a night watchman, walking the quiet streets he had once left behind with ambition. Owen Chase returned to sea briefly. He commanded another whaling voyage, but found the experience different after the Essex. Confidence came more slowly. The ocean no longer represented opportunity alone. It carried memory. Chase later wrote an account of the disaster. His narrative was measured, factual, and restrained. It avoided drama, focusing instead on events as they unfolded. The book circulated widely, read by sailors and civilians alike. It became one of the primary sources through which the story of the Essex was preserved. Thomas Nickerson lived with the experience for decades. As a young cabin boy, he had witnessed loss at an age when memory imprints deeply. He returned to Nantucket, lived a quiet life, and wrote his own account much later. His manuscript remained unpublished for generations, discovered only long after his death. Together, these accounts formed a record. They described not heroism in the traditional sense, but endurance, decisions made under pressure, survival shaped by necessity rather than choice. The story resisted romantic framing. The whaling industry continued. Ships still sailed from Nantucket and New Bedford. Crews still chased whales across distant oceans. Yet something had shifted. The idea of absolute mastery over the sea felt less certain. The Essex itself left no physical trace. No wreckage was recovered. No marker remained where it was struck. The ocean absorbed the ship completely, leaving only memory and record behind. What endured was the lesson. The voyage revealed the limits of preparation, the consequences of isolation, and the fragile balance between survival and humanity. It showed how quickly civilization could be stripped away, not by chaos, but by the quiet arithmetic of hunger and distance. The men of the Essex had set out to harvest the sea. Instead, they became part of its history, carried forward not by water, but by words, recollection, and the slow passing of a story that refused to disappear. Long after the men of the Essex had returned or been buried at sea, the story continued its slow passage through time. It was not a tale often spoken aloud in full. In whaling towns, fragments surfaced in conversation, usually late at night, when work was done and the sea lay dark beyond the harbor lights. Sailors spoke of whales differently after that. Not with fear, but with caution. Power was no longer abstract. The ocean had answered back. For those who lived through the voyage, memory arrived uninvited. It appeared in ordinary moments, the creak of wood, the smell of tar, the sight of an empty horizon. These reminders carried no drama, only weight. Survival had not brought closure. It brought permanence. Some men avoided the sea entirely. Others returned because the sea was the only life they knew. But, even among those who sailed again, something had shifted. Risk was measured more carefully. Distance felt longer. Isolation felt sharper. The written accounts endured quietly. Chase's narrative found readers far beyond Nantucket. It reached scholars, sailors, and writers. Decades later, it would influence literature, shaping imagined oceans and symbolic whales, though the original story remained grounded in fact rather than metaphor. Nickerson's manuscript slept in obscurity. It waited in drawers and archives, unnoticed until rediscovered generations later. When finally read, it added depth rather than contradiction. Another voice confirming the same truth from a different angle. Together they preserved what the sea could not erase. The tragedy of the Essex did not change the course of history in loud ways. No laws were rewritten. No industry collapsed overnight. Instead, it altered understanding slowly, like weathering. It reminded those who listened that endurance has limits, that planning can fail, that survival sometimes demands choices no one prepares for, and that the sea, vast and patient, does not care who crosses it or why. Today, the story remains. It is told not for shock, but for remembrance. Not to glorify suffering, but to acknowledge it. The men of the Essex are remembered not as victims or heroes alone, but as sailors who faced the edge of human endurance and did not look away. The ocean they crossed is still there. It moves as it always has, quietly, endlessly, carrying ships, swallowing others, and holding stories beneath its surface, waiting for those willing to listen. And when the telling grows still, when the voice softens and the night deepens, the sea returns to silence. As it did after the Essex disappeared from its surface, leaving only memory behind. Years passed. The harbor at Nantucket continued its familiar rhythms. Ships arrived and departed. Rigging creaked in the wind. Lamps glowed softly along the docks at night. To an outsider, nothing suggested that one of the ocean's most harrowing stories had begun here. Yet memory lingered quietly. Older sailors sometimes paused when passing a certain berth, or when hearing the name of a ship spoken to casually. They did not correct the speaker. They did not interrupt. The sea taught restraint as much as it taught endurance. George Pollard walked the streets at night. As a watchman, his steps followed a steady pattern. The town slept while he moved through it, lantern in hand, listening for sounds that did not belong. Some nights the wind carried the smell of salt far inland. On those nights he walked a little slower. Owen Chase lived with order. He wrote, worked, and spoke little of the past unless asked directly. When he did speak, his words remained measured. He described events, not emotions. Those who listened sensed the effort it took to keep memory contained. Thomas Nickerson aged quietly. He carried the sea with him in ways no one could see. When he finally set his memories down on paper, it was not to reopen wounds, but to set them somewhere they could rest. The Essex itself faded into history. No planks survived. No iron fittings were recovered. The ship existed only in records, ink, and recollection. The ocean kept the rest, and yet something remained. Not the suffering, not the hunger, not the fear. What remained was understanding that distance matters, that preparation has limits, that the sea grants no guarantees. As night settles and the story slows, the voices fade. The oars stop moving. The horizon darkens. The water becomes smooth again. The men of the Essex are no longer adrift. They are no longer rowing. They are no longer waiting. They have passed into the long quiet of history, where stories are carried not by waves but by time. And the sea, vast, patient, unchanged, continues on, holding its silence. The voyage of the Essex did not end when the survivors returned to land. Its story traveled farther than the ship ever had. In the years that followed, accounts of the disaster moved quietly beyond Nantucket. Sailors carried the tale into ports across the Atlantic. Written records passed from hand to hand, read by men who had never lowered a whaleboat into the Pacific, yet understood the weight of what they were reading. Among those who encountered the story was a young writer named Herman Melville. Melville met Owen Chase years after the disaster and read his written account. He listened to the details of the whale strike. The sinking of the ship, the long drift across open water, and the endurance of men pushed beyond expectation. These facts stayed with him, not as history alone, but as something larger. From them, a different kind of story emerged. In Melville's hands, the real whale of the Essex became symbolic. The violence of the encounter transformed into obsession. The open ocean became a stage for human ambition, fear, and defiance. While Moby-Dick was a work of fiction, its roots lay firmly in reality. In the moment, a whale turned and struck a ship, proving that nature could not be mastered. The influence was never hidden. Melville acknowledged it openly, drawing from Chase's narrative and the known facts of the voyage. Yet the original story remained distinct. Less philosophical, more restrained, and grounded in lived experience rather than metaphor. Long after Moby-Dick found its place in literature, the Essex returned again to public attention. In the modern era, historians revisited the original records. Nickerson's long-lost manuscript surfaced, adding clarity and depth. Together, these sources form the basis for In the Heart of the Sea, a detailed retelling that returned the story to its human scale. Here, the emphasis shifted back to small boats on an immense ocean. The whale was no longer a symbol. It was an animal acting on instinct. The sea was not abstract. It was heat, thirst, and time without landmarks. The Essex became both things at once. A foundation for one of the greatest novels ever written, and a real event that needed no embellishment to carry weight. As night settles over the story, these layers coexist. The fictional ocean and the real one. The symbolic whale and the living animal. The imagined Pequod and the lost Essex. They drift together now, separate but connected, carried forward by memory rather than water. The ship itself is gone, but its wake remains. In history, in literature, and in the quiet understanding that some stories endure not because they are retold loudly, but because they are true. And with that, the sea grows calm again. There is nothing left to add. The wake has long since faded. The water has closed. The horizon holds no ships. What once demanded effort now asks nothing at all. The sea does not remember struggle the way humans do. It absorbs it, smooths it, and moves on. Wood rots, iron rusts, voices fall quiet. Only motion remains. Somewhere far from shore, waves pass over the place where the Essex once floated, not knowing, not caring, not needing to know. And that is enough. The story rests now. The ocean breathes. The night continues. Nothing more is required.